A man who murdered a female police officer over 40 years ago has been found to be responsible for the cold case murders of 4 women in Denver, Colorado between 1978 and 1981. Each of the cold case victims were lewdly assaulted and suffered multiple stab wounds. The first victim was 33-year-old Madeline Liverday, who was a writer and ecologist who published a book and wrote for magazines. On the morning of the 7th of December, she was feeding her 2 young children breakfast in the home located in the 1600 block of Poplar Street, Denver, when a man came to her door and confronted her before forcing his way in and repeatedly stabbing her. The next victim murdered was 53-year-old Dolores Baharis, who was walking to work at just after 7 a.m. on the 10th of August 1980. She worked in the cafeteria section of the Fairmont Hotel, located near 18th and Welton Streets in Denver. She worked during the summer while spending time visiting her family. This was to be her last day working there, before moving out of state back to El Paso in Texas. On the way to the hotel, she was brutally attacked and stabbed, and her lifeless body was found lying in the street in the 500 block of East 17th Street. Dolores' family asked for the police not to release her picture. The third victim was 27-year-old Gwendolyn Harris. She often visited the Polo Club Lounge, which was located near the downtown streets of 15th and Tremont in Denver. She was last seen at the lounge on the evening of the 20th of December 1980. The following morning, at around 10:45 a.m, she was found stabbed to death at the intersection of East 47th Avenue and Andrews Drive in Montbello, Denver. The last cold case victim was 17-year-old Antoinette Parks, who was almost 7 months pregnant and studied at the Gateway High School in Aurora, Denver. On the 24th of January 1981, she went to her boyfriend's house near 64th Avenue and Broadway. She got into an argument with him, so she stormed off. Later that day, a garbage collector discovered her lifeless and battered body nearby in an Adams County field near a trash bin. She was initially mistaken for a mannequin. She had been stabbed 23 times on the top of her head and in her chest, and she had a stick thrust inside of her, killing her unborn child. She had defensive wounds on her hands and had scratch marks on her face from hitting the pavement while being pulled by her legs, and had tumbleweed in her hair, indicating that she had been dragged to the spot. Initially, it was thought that her boyfriend was responsible, as he was unhappy with her pregnancy, but he denied any wrongdoing, and he was later cleared. The authorities initially investigated the cases separately, but between 2013 and 2018, the Denver Police Crime Lab linked the 4 women by the same suspect's DNA. However, the attacker was unknown. In mid-2021, the investigators used the DNA to track down a relative of the killer and identified Joe Michael Irvin as a potential suspect. Joe, however, took his life in July of 1981. The authorities exhumed Joe's remains in late 2021 for direct DNA comparison to the crime scene evidence. In early January of 2022, Joe's DNA was found to match all 4 crimes. On the 28th of January 2022, the authorities announced that they have closed all 4 cold cases and identified Joe as responsible for all 4 murders. Police records show these weren't the only crimes Joe committed, however. On the 27th of June 1981, Joe was pulled over for a traffic violation by 26-year-old Aurora police officer Deborah Sue Kaur, who'd been with the police force for 1 year. She stopped him at the intersection of East Colfax Avenue and Moline Street in Aurora, Colorado, and when she attempted to handcuff him, Joe grabbed a gun and shot her. Joe then wounded a male bystander by shooting him in the back after he tried helping the officer. The authorities quickly traced Joe's license plate down to his Aurora home, where he was found attempting to saw off the handcuffs off his wrist, and he was arrested. While awaiting trial for Deborah's murder, Joe took his life in prison the following month. On the 10th of February 2022, the authorities announced they finally solved the 1964 cold case rape and murder of 9-year-old girl Maurice Chivarella. The events unfolded at around 8 a.m. on the 18th of March 1964, when Maurice left her home at 533 Alta Street in Hazelton, Pennsylvania. She walked alone to St. Joseph's School, which was only a few blocks away North Laurel Street, or roughly half a mile. She would usually walk there with her 2 older brothers and older sister, but that morning she decided to leave 5 minutes earlier. She was carrying canned food to donate to a feast day food drive at the school. According to the authorities, she was last seen walking near 6th Street and Church Street at around 8:10 a.m. within an area that's usually built up with traffic. Later that day, at around 1 p.m, Maurice's beaten and lifeless body was found in a hole at a waste coal pit. It was roughly about 2.5 miles from her home, just north of State Route 309, adjacent to the Hazelton airport. She was clothed, but her shoes had been removed and all her possessions were strewn about nearby. Her hands and feet were bound together with shoelaces, and she had a multicoloured scarf shoved into her mouth. The authorities arrived and collected evidence at the scene, including foreign bodily fluid recovered from her body and on her jacket, and people were questioned. An autopsy determined that she had been bashed in the head, raped and then strangled to death. One local man wanted for questioning ended up taking his life by carbon monoxide poisoning just before he was due to sit a lie detector test. Over 200 investigators and troopers were assigned the case from the beginning, but despite an extensive investigation at the time, leads dried up and the case went cold. In 2007, investigators re-examined the case. They entered the DNA collected from the crime scene into the CODIS DNA database. A suspect's DNA profile was developed, however no matches were found. In late 2018, detectives partnered with DNA specialist company Parabon. In March of 2019, advances in technology allowed them to develop a snapshot phenotype picture of the suspect using his DNA. It helped predict the suspect's physical traits and ancestry, with age-progressive images of what he may look like at ages 25, 40 and 60. The suspect was said to be a man with fair complexion, a wide nose, dark hair, and green or hazel-coloured eyes. In March of 2019, the image was released to the public in hopes of finding the suspect, but no one had been identified. In 2020, Parabon submitted the DNA into a genealogy database, whereas compared to other DNA in the system, and a very distant sixth cousin of the suspect was found. Towards the end of 2021, they managed to track down closer relatives of the suspect, whom were interviewed and provided voluntary DNA samples. They then narrowed their search down to James Paul Fort, who was born on the 21st of July 1941, but passed away from natural causes at the age of 38 in 1980. The authorities exhumed James's body in January of 2022. His DNA was collected and found to be an exact match to the DNA on Maurice's body and on her jacket. On the 10th of February 2022, the authorities declared James Ford as Maurice's killer, who would have been 22 at the time of the offence. James wasn't on the investigators' radar at the time of Maurice's murder. The authorities said that James was later arrested by state police in 1974 for a violent lewd assault of a woman, which he pleaded guilty to and was sentenced to 1 year probation. He had another run-in with the law in 1978 for reckless endangerment and harassment. It was discovered that James lived only 6 blocks away from Maurice's home at the time of the murder. He had no connection with Maurice's family. James worked as a bartender at a convention hall on State Route 309 in Hazelton for several years, where he collapsed and died from heart failure on the 16th of May 1980. On the 2nd of February 2022, the authorities have announced that a man was responsible for 4 murders, with 3 of those being cold case murders in the 1980s in Eugene, Oregon, has now been identified. The first murder came to light at around 2:42 p.m. on the 5th of June 1986, when an employee of an apartment complex located at 255 High Street went in to check on 62-year-old Gladys May Hensley after she hadn't been seen for a few days. After entering her apartment, her lifeless body was found and the authorities were contacted. When the authorities arrived, they determined that Gladys had been murdered sometime in the early hours of the previous morning. 2 weeks later, on the 19th of June 1986, the authorities found 33-year-old Janice Marie Dickinson's lifeless body behind a car dealership located at 20 Coburg Road. She had been disrobed and lewdly assaulted before being killed. While police didn't locate a suspect at the time, they believed the 2 murders were connected, but the case went cold. On the 28th of February 1988, 73-year-old Geraldine Spencer Toohey was found dead in a home located in the 5400 block of Franklin Boulevard. There were signs of forced entry into her home, and she'd been violated and murdered. The police believe that all 3 murders were linked based on similarities in the crimes and evidence left at the scene, so they reached out for the public's help. They received tips and witness accounts and developed a sketch of the suspect on the 12th of March 1988, but it didn't lead to any arrests. In 2016, the authorities partnered with Parabon, They used phenotyping technology to determine the physical attributes of the suspect based on the offender's DNA left at the crime scenes. A detailed snapshot of the suspect was developed in September of 2017 and was released to the public in 2018 in hopes of generating new leads. More than 100 tips were received, and several persons of interest were developed, but the DNA taken for comparison to the crime scenes did not match, and they were cleared. In May of 2018, they used genetic genealogy and developed family trees of relatives of the suspect using the DNA at the crime scenes, as well as visiting ancestry websites to narrow their search down to John Charles Bolsinger. John was 28 years old at the time of the first cold case murder of Gladys, and was linked to all 3 crimes. These, however, were not the only crimes that John committed. Police records show that John served a 5-year prison sentence in 1980 after committing murder in Salt Lake City, Utah, but was released in March of 1986. 6 months later, on the 26th of September 1986, he was re-arrested after he broke into a woman's home along the 300 block of South 51st Place in Springfield, Oregon. In that incident, the woman told investigators that she was at home having trouble sleeping and she heard a dog making strange noises in the kitchen, so she went to investigate. All the interior lights were off. There was the light on outside at the rear sliding door. She saw a stranger peering through the kitchen window, and he gained entry by sliding the window open. She ran to the living room to call 911. While on the phone, the man entered the room. He stood still for a moment and then approached her. She started screaming as the suspect tried to pull the phone from her hand. She started hitting him with the phone and a flashlight, and he fled through the kitchen window and left behind a down vest and a paring knife. The authorities arrived at the scene. They heard the woman screaming and the police dog managed to chase John down nearby. He reportedly told police he knocked on the door 3 to 4 times and walked away, and claimed to have memory loss when questioned further about why he was there. After being taken into custody, he was released on the 9th of December 1987. On the 23rd of March 1988, the authorities discovered that John took his own life in his apartment on the 100 block of Mill Street in Springfield, Oregon. During the press conference held on the 2nd of February 2022, it was announced that the Eugene Police Department and the Oregon State Police were pleased to finally bring closure to the family members of Gladys, Janice, and Geraldine, as well as the community. It was said that both agencies remain committed to constantly evaluating unsolved cases and utilising emerging technologies to bring closure to other families of crime victims. On the 2nd of February 2022, the authorities arrested a man in connection to the 14-year-old cold case murder of 41-year-old Tonya Ann Ortman, who lived at the Nature's Trail Mobile Home Park, located off Morris Bridge Road in Thonotosassa, Florida. The incident occurred at around 1:22 a.m. on the 17th of July 2007, when the authorities received a call from Jonathan Burns, who was 43 years old at the time, who lived at and co-owned the park. He called to report that he had been stabbed during an altercation with a tenant. When deputies arrived at the scene, located at 12,928 Crisp Place, they found John between 2 pickup trucks outside his home, which also doubled as an office for the park. Tonya's lifeless body was found nearby on her back, on the ground outside a rented neighbouring mobile home. She had been stabbed 4 times in her chest, and she had a large gash on her neck. John had 2 stab wounds to his stomach, his arms had scratches and his fingers had small lacerations, and he was taken to the local hospital for surgery, where he later recovered. When John was questioned, he said that Tonya attacked him and started stabbing him, so in self-defense he stabbed her. While investigating the crime scene, detectives found blood near the trash bin about 29 feet from Tonya's body, and blood leading back to John's home. Inside the house, the investigators found a bloody knife. Forensic tests at the time showed the blood on the ground and on the knife matched John's DNA profile. It was noted that John's blood was not found near Tonya's body, and Tonya's blood was not found near the dumpster. An autopsy concluded that Tonya died from multiple stab wounds to the chest that penetrated her heart and lungs. The investigators learnt that Tonya used a walker and a wheelchair, and she found it difficult to move about as she was unsteady on her feet. When the case was presented to the state attorney's office, it was concluded there was insufficient evidence to refute John's version of events. In 2021, cold case detectives re-examined the case. On the 14th of January 2022, a detective went back to John's home in the park and interviewed him about the events surrounding Tonya's stabbing. John told the investigator that he'd been drinking heavily that night, and Tonya started yelling at him as he walked to the laundry room to close it. He said he then walked over to her mobile home and she punched him in the stomach. John said he later realised he was bleeding. He said that Tonya was not armed with any type of weapon and never took his knife, but he said he thinks she stabbed him. Just over a week after the interview, a witness contacted the authorities saying she had some information they might be interested in. During an interview with a detective, the witness said John approached her in the mobile home park. He said he was interviewed by the authorities and told her he knows he did something wrong and he wants to face it. The witness said that John told her that he knew that Tonya was disabled at the time. The witness said John gave her a signed letter containing an account of what happened. She passed this on to the detective on the 25th of January. 2 days later, the witness contacted the detective again. The witness said John approached her and told her he wrote the letter as if acting in self-defense, as he figured he'll get less time. The witness said John told her that Tonya had gotten what she deserved and he didn't feel bad about it. On the 28th of January, the witness gave the detective a second statement, written and signed by John, that contradicted the first statement. On the 1st of February, the witness contacted the detective yet again. She said John had given her a third statement after she confronted him with the contradictions between the letters and what he verbally told her. The witness's son was also present for this conversation, and they both asked John how he was stabbed. John said he saw Tonya while walking to the laundry room, so he returned home to get his knife before walking over to talk to her. John said an argument led to them fighting over the knife, and when Tonya tried to go home, he stabbed her several times and cut her throat. John said he then stabbed himself in the stomach because it would look good for self-defense. After handing over his third statement, he said it contained the truth. The letter ended with an admission that he disliked Tonya and intended to hurt her that night, but he unfortunately killed her. This was a terrible tragedy that I'm responsible for, and I wish I could change it, he said. The details in the third statement were consistent with the evidence collected at the crime scene, and the investigators matched a fingerprint on one of the statements to John. Deputies arrested John on the 2nd of February at his home in the park and is facing charges for Tonya's murder. On the 4th of February, he appeared in court in Tampa, where his bond was set at $50,000. On the 7th of February 2022, 55-year-old Charlie James Hall was arrested for the cold case murders of 2 men during a violent robbery spree that occurred more than 30 years ago. The authorities say that Charlie attacked at least 16 people in downtown Orlando, Florida, between August and October of 1987. He targeted vulnerable elderly homeless people by beating them over the head repeatedly with a metal bar and stealing their possessions while they slept on a piece of cardboard next to a building. There was minimal financial gain from these vicious attacks, where wristwatches and a few dollars were stolen. On the 24th of August, Lawrence Stewart was found lying on his back in a grassy area, bleeding profusely from his head after being struck with a metal bar in the 400 block of West Robinson Street, and passed away 41 days later. On the 4th of September, Louis Holloway was found unconscious in a parking lot in East Livingston Street. He was struck in the face and head before being robbed and passed away 2 days later. Both victims died from blunt force trauma to their heads, and their possessions were strewn about, and the authorities collected evidence at the crime scenes. On the 16th of October 1987, Charlie was arrested after authorities staked out an area where the attacks took place. When he was brought in for questioning, he confessed to several of the robberies, but denied committing the murders. Charlie said that he was addicted to crack, and that he would suddenly click while walking down the streets. He said he would hear voices in his head and start laughing and talking to himself before going through changes and passing out. Detectives submitted blood evidence in an attempt to link Charlie to the deaths, but the methods in the 1980s were insufficient and Charlie wasn't charged for the murders at the time. He was, however, imprisoned for the robberies, but was later released in August of 1990. He later served further stints in prison for separate burglaries until October of 2010. The Orlando Cold Case Unit re-examined the 2 murders in December of 2021. After performing a series of DNA tests on the evidence collected in 1987, investigators went to Charlie's home on the 19th of January 2022. They had a warrant to obtain a DNA cheek swab from Charlie for testing for comparison to the crime scene evidence. Faced with the likelihood that a DNA match would link him to the crimes, he started to confess. When Charlie was questioned by investigators what the chances are that his DNA will come back as a match to the murder weapon, he said he was 80% sure. When asked what keeps him from the other 20%, he said him not wanting to deal with this. He then broke down and cried and said he's been wrestling with this case for 34 years. He said even when he was in prison he couldn't sleep knowing that he hurt a lot of people. The DNA results came back a match, and Charlie was arrested on the 7th of February 2022. He's held without bond at the Orange County Jail. He's been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder,